Good morning, everybody, and welcome to day 2 of our Microsoft Virtual Roadshow, where we're going to spend today talking about getting cloud right the first time, and we'll go pretty deep into what we mean by getting cloud right the first time, particularly with Microsoft Azure. Thank you all that were able to join yesterday and come back today. Really looking forward to diving into the other side of the Microsoft Cloud, speaking a lot about modern workplace and Office 365 and Microsoft 365 solutions yesterday, where Jesus went into detail of all the different solutions that are throughout the Microsoft 365 suite, how we can secure those, and we shared some success stories and how organizations adopted modern workplace to transform their businesses and create extraordinary end user experiences. We'll have a few comments today how all this stuff relates together, but really appreciate your time today. I know it's a large investment of time, so we are very appreciative of that. We had just south of 100 active attendees yesterday with some great questions. So really excited to have a phenomenal day 2 and would encourage everybody to continue to ask questions. As mentioned, my name is Jason Webster. I am the principal for the Mid-Atlantic for eGroup. I'm responsible for eGroup's business in the Mid-Atlantic and come from a technical background with Microsoft Solutions, both as a software developer, leading software development teams, and helping implement Microsoft Solutions at eGroup over the last 12 to 13 years with our clients, but also prior to that, working with content management systems, databases, business intelligence systems for about 20 years. So looking forward to sharing you some of the things that I've learned and some of the things that the greater team at eGroup's learned, but also, more importantly, some of the things that the hundreds of clients that I've had the opportunity to interact with over the last couple of decades have been able to teach us. And we've been able to mold that into a cohesive strategy that we call getting cloud right the first time. Alongside me, Jesus Shelby, our Director of Cloud Services, will step up, and I'll let him introduce himself at the kind of beginning of his presentation. So without further ado, let's dive right in. Housekeeping items. As yesterday, questions. If you're not familiar with Microsoft Live Events or you were not in the event yesterday, there is a question and answer feature within the Teams live events. So what we would ask is that all questions go through that. All participants are muted. There's no camera sharing. We got a few questions around some of that. But if you ask the question inside the question and answer portal, Jesus, while I'm presenting, or myself while Jesus is presenting, we'll be manning the question and answers, and we'll either interrupt the presentation to ask those questions live if they're relevant to the broader audience, and if not, we can answer those in a one-on-one fashion privately in that question and answer portal. So please feel free to ask as many questions as you like, and if we need to go deeper, we can always take those offline and set up calls to kind of dig in. We'll also take breaks. So we've got a packed agenda, 3 presentations, but we'll talk about kind of how that's going to flow here in a second, but we'll take breaks between those. But as always with webinars and virtual webinars, adult rules do apply. If you get an email, you get a call, or you need to step away for a second, please feel free to do so. We won't even know. So definitely feel free to take breaks as needed. And at the end, we will be selecting a winner for a choice between an away carry-on suitcase. Travel starting to look light at the end of that tunnel and back on the horizon for a lot of us over the next year. So suitcase is timely. Summer's upon us, so we're giving away a Ray-Ban gift card. Or for those that are inclined, can choose a $150 donation to the charity of their choice. All right. So diving into our agenda today, the goal is pretty simple. Discuss how to confidently adopt Microsoft Cloud Solutions and get it right the first time. We completely understand that organizations are at different points in their journey. We often talk about meeting our clients where they're at in that journey and helping them develop roadmaps to get where they want to be. It's no different in modern workplace as it is in Azure, trying to understand what the goals of the organization are. Understanding where you are currently today and building all the steps along the way that we need to get you to where you want to be is our reason for existence and our value in the IT space. So how we're going to get there today is we'll continue this welcome and introduction, not too much longer, but I will jump up and dive into successful cloud adoption. This presentation specifically is going to be pretty high level, and my goal with it, well, even high level, and I would say it's going to feel like we're jumping around a little bit, but my goal with the successful cloud adoption presentation is to cast a wide net with the large amount of attendees that we have, and find those relevant points to small, medium, large, and hyperscale organizations that are adopting cloud that eGroup works with every day, and find those principles with the cloud adoption framework from Microsoft that we'll talk about that can apply to you, understanding that some of them need a really simple and effective policy and how they go about their adoption framework, and some with multiple subscriptions and millions of dollars of spend annually need something a little more complex. But there's going to be something in there for everybody, and my goal at that is to first and foremost educate you all on exactly what is available and kind of how that cloud adoption framework works and the different components of it and the considerations you need to be taking when planning your cloud, but also how it relates to our Azure blueprint and how we can help you translate some of these very high level topics that have very, very deep foundations and complexity within them to fit your business and be efficient with it. Following that, we're going to take it from high level and we're going to bring it down to the ground pretty quickly. Jesus is going to talk about cloud security. So I'm going to breeze over some of the security components to not steal his thunder, but we're going to talk about things like identity management and network architecture and all the different things that you need to do to secure your cloud, with security being at the forefront of most people's minds when talking about going into public cloud adoption. And then lastly, in a brief session, I'll come up at the end and talk about where to get started. Over the last 5 years, eGroup, we found that many organizations, whether they're starting or whether they're cloud mature, there's some commonalities between different things that they can do that can deliver significant impact to the organization, solve challenges, things like disaster recovery, data protection, end user access with virtual desktops, doing things like proof of concepts for application deployments, platform as a service. There's always these different things that you can do that are bite-sized chunks that really solidify all the things we're talking about from successful cloud adoption, get your design in place, and really help organizations learn a little bit by doing, but doing that with a safety net. So I'm going to share some stories and approaches in which we do that with some of what we call our key plays. Lastly, we'll do wrap-ups. We'll talk about the giveaway, and again, we'll take some breaks, every about 5 to 10 minutes, depending on pacing here. One more thing to note, we probably won't stay exactly on this schedule. We'll try our best to, but the goal is to get you the information and get you out as efficiently as possible. Depends on questions, things like that. We have plenty of time baked in for those. So if you're looking for one section, just keep in mind that they may not start 15 minutes after the hour, every hour as planned. We'll roll right into them to be as efficient as possible. Okay, so the summary of what you're going to see today is pretty simple. Not so much like the Venn diagram to the right, which is pretty complex, and it looks like a mess, and there's a lot of different things that we have to talk about. But our goal is to share a common approach in which we can help you get your cloud implementations right the first time, or if you're already somewhere along the way, get them on track, address some gaps that you may have, or simply validate that what you're doing fits the ever commonly used term, quote unquote, best practices. So we're going to talk about things at various levels of depth, from governance to how do you configure the cloud, to how do you migrate to the cloud, how do you protect information, how do you monitor, so important, how do you monitor once you're there. And as I mentioned, Jesus is going to go pretty deep into the security components of the cloud. We're going to touch on all that, but more importantly, I want to communicate that as we go through this, it's going to sound like, wow, this is a lot, but it doesn't have to be messy, and it also doesn't have to be complex. The magic in creating a blueprint for your success is to really understand where you want to be, understanding the components of a cloud adoption framework that are relevant for you. Not all of these will be. I'll go ahead and say that right out of the gate. in building your cloud approach, your discipline strategy for adopting the cloud that leads to the outcomes that you want to see as simply as possible and is right size for your business. So that's my disclaimer, is that not everything will be relevant, but at the same time, having some of these things where you pick 1 and 2 of this category. I want to go fully deep on compliance because I have a big compliance need within my organization. All these different things adapt to your cloud strategy, which ultimately create your cloud success. Before we get started, for those that weren't here yesterday, a little bit about eGroup. We were founded in 1999, so we've been around for a little bit over 2 decades, and very thankful of our customers and clients throughout the nation and worldwide that have delivered that success. We always say that our clients are our chief investors. We wouldn't be here without them. And satisfaction and customer satisfaction and measuring customer satisfaction is at the forefront of everything we do, because we truly believe that our success is delivered from your success, and our ability to help you with things like Microsoft 365 and Azure and deliver successful outcomes to your business enables our success on the back end of that. With Microsoft specifically, we're a managed national partner, which is the highest level of Microsoft partnership that you can have, particularly with Modern Workplace and Azure Solutions. We regularly work alongside of your Microsoft teams. I know a lot of you may be having your first introduction to eGroup and myself and Jesus and what we're doing with cloud because a Microsoft representative shared this link with you today. The way I always like to casually summarize that is that, our relationship with Microsoft allows us to, stay on the forefront of these technologies and understand what's coming, as well as, see a lot of success out there that we can then share with you. But it also gives us access to all the funding programs, all the incentives, all the different things that Microsoft can bring to the table, that when you connect in yourself plus Microsoft plus eGroup, allow you to go further with the least amount of dollars and time investment and maximize your success as possible. So definitely love working with that relationship and bringing Microsoft teams to the table to deliver your joint success. When it comes to Azure Solutions specifically, we deliver architecture services, design services, governance, optimization, which we're going to talk a lot about in the first section. Obviously, security. Jesus is going to come up and talk a little bit about that. But some of the more block and tackle things like infrastructure migrations, data protection, disaster recovery, virtual desktops, data modernization, some of those topics, we have a extensive track record of helping organizations with those challenges, like holistically or in isolation, working with one specific topic in that sphere. Beyond Microsoft, obviously being around for the last 2 decades, we weren't always working in the cloud, but technology names change, but the concepts are very similar. We do work with Microsoft 365 and Microsoft Azure, as mentioned, but we also help organizations in their data centers modernize their data center architectures with things like hyperconverged solutions, advanced networks and security, advanced wireless solutions, cloud managed voice solutions, talking about things like global networks, network connectivity, hybrid connectivity to the cloud, data protection, talking about how do we back up data, secure our information from ransomware, meet retention policies and compliance, disaster recovery, how do we make our solutions highly available so that when we're in the cloud, on-prem, multi-cloud, solutions are available in the event of disaster, downtime, how do we make that happen? Virtual desktops and end-user computing. How do we, once we have a highly available infrastructure full of SaaS and cloud-based solutions, how do we present that to the end users in a secure and efficient manner that allows them to do their jobs effectively? And then last but not least, the managed services that are flexible to help your organization support any of these objectives or completely manage them for you as a completely managed solution. All right, so with that, we'll dive right into our first presentation here. And What I want to talk about, you can see over on the right here a little bit, is some of the different things we're going to talk about, what is commonly known as the cloud adoption framework with Microsoft, and what successful cloud adoption means for organizations. And I'll kind of put my lens on that based on what I've seen over the years, but also I'm going to lean heavily on some of the Microsoft materials that have been produced. I don't know if everybody has experienced this, but over the last, I would say, 5 years, Microsoft has really upped the game in the quality and consistency and up-to-date content that they deliver through the documentation platforms, particularly not just documenting solutions and how things work or troubleshooting frequently asked questions or forum style, break fix type things, but helping organizations develop strategies, giving them frameworks for success, and even decision logic to be able to make intelligent decisions about how to adopt IT. So I'm going to be leaning heavily on some of those things and walk you through some of those topics. But at the end of this, I'll also share some of my favorite location where some of this up-to-date content that's living, breathing material exists, so that you can reference it and go beyond the surface level. If we're talking Inception, it's about 20 layers deep in some of these cases. So you can get as granular as you want with some of these topics. So before we jump into the specific ones, ultimately everything that we're doing here is part of what eGroup calls the Azure Blueprint. So when we talk about confidently adopting solutions, we regularly meet with customers. In the past, it would be we'd spend a day, 2, 3 days. We'd break that up. We'd go to Microsoft MTCs. We would come to your office. We would bring in subject matter experts from eGroup, specialists from Microsoft in various segments, multiple people, and we would run workshops where we'd all sit around. And one of the things that we would want to know is, tell us about your business, understanding what your clients get from you, like what value do you deliver to your clients, to your end users, what is the purpose of your business, and what are you all after? Where are you at today, so that we can then talk about how these solutions can enhance or streamline or drive efficiency there. We would spend multiple days working with you all. We do this in a virtual setting today, so we can still do these, and we still do the blueprints, and we all get on Teams meetings and kind of go through some of the stuff. But the idea there is everything you're going to hear about today, we can come to your office, we can meet virtually and help you all with these decisions, go deep into these decisions, make them relevant to you, and ultimately deliver on 3 things. One is enablement, helping your team understand what it means to have success in Azure, both from a business standpoint, technical standpoint, risk management, all of those things. What it means to be secure in the cloud. Security, again, is at the forefront of everything we do. So how do we secure identities? How do we secure networks? How do we ensure that the information we're responsible for hosting for clients, and that from your context, the information you're responsible for hosting for your clients is secure and being delivered efficiently? And then helping you build roadmaps for how to adopt the solutions that we agree on are great ideas and that we want to start moving forward with, whether it's doing something like simple like virtual desktops or backups or disaster recovery policy, or you're looking to design a cloud first mentality for the organization so that you can start moving into the IaaS, PaaS, SaaS world as a cloud first organization. So it is something that we can help you do and go deeper on some of these different topics, and we'll talk about that a little bit more towards the end of the webinar. So when we talk in general about adoption, I've always liked this picture, right? I think it simplifies compared to some of the other ones around the pillars that we need to discuss. One is security. Jesus, again, we'll be talking in deep depth about that. One is protection. How do we back up and how do we provide disaster recovery and how do we do that right size? Everybody needs backups. Everybody needs protection from, things that they don't expect. We always say you're only protection and security, and you're only as secure as your ability to recover everything really fast is something I like to say a lot. So when we talk about backups, the security really starts on the back end with, okay, if we lost everything, how do we get it back? And then we can work our way from there. And then disaster recovery, what are those critical workloads that just can't go offline? That maybe 1/9 of protection or 1/9 of uptime is not enough, right? So we need to have mission critical apps and have a unique but applicable to you disaster recovery plan for. Skipping over monitoring for a second and talk about configuration. Configuration is, a lot of organizations we see start off in a good configuration, then they have some drift, right? So when we talk about configuration, what we really want to talk about is, where do you initially need to land? But how are you going to manage different things, whether it's servers, whether it's applications, whether it's databases? How are you going to patch? How are you going to update some of those things? But how can we automate that? How can we treat infrastructure as code so that we have consistency, we stay consistent, and we can lead into some of the governance and monitoring tactics, which are things like being able to audit and ensure that we are what we say we are. If we build a network and we say that it's secure and this is the configuration, that a year later that it still meets that configuration, and we can simply audit that, and we can apply that as a measure of policy. We'll talk in depth about some of those things, but configuration, how do we control configuration drift? How do we monitor it? How do we do ongoing maintenance? And then most certainly, how do we manage cost? I think that's one of the top questions we get is, how do I ensure that I'm getting the best deal? How do I ensure that when I go to the cloud that I can manage costs? How do I have visibility into that? We'll talk about the tools and platforms and kind of tactics available there. And then that all leads, like if you kind of have all those policies in place from governance to configuration to monitoring to protection and security, then you're ready to migrate, right? So that's when you start putting workloads into the cloud. And when we go back, we talk about a data center isn't built by deploying your first application. Your cloud shouldn't be either. All too often, we see toe dips into the cloud, or organizations adopting the cloud in a kind of iterative fashion that if you logically think about it in the context of, well, how did we build data centers and how did we go back and what did we do when planning a data center? We want to have that same type of due diligence and planning ahead of the cloud. It's not go swipe a credit card, get an Azure subscription and start deploying a website, right? There's a lot of more things that we want to do. It doesn't have to be messy, it doesn't have to be hard, but there's a lot of things we want to do before we get into that. So we're going to talk a lot about landing zones. There's going to be the term landing zone. I love this definition. If we were in person, you kind of see the tongue-in-cheek nature of this. The term landing zone refers to an environment that's been provisioned and prepared to host workloads in a cloud environment like Azure. That statement and definition of landing zone says a lot, but to me, it really says nothing, right? It's when you summarize it, basically as a landing zone is a environment in Azure. Okay, got it. Not exactly sure what that means, what the definition of it is. So we're gonna expand upon that and help you really understand landing zones and what that terminology means as we go through these 10 items along the right side. But for those that have been working in Azure or have been working with eGroup in the past, you might have heard us talk about the enterprise scaffold, kind of the framework in which you put in place to build cloud solutions on. Everything from, what type, as you can see in the chart, what type of compute, what type of network, what type of storage, what type of data do I need, down into the primitives of, how am I going to organize that from management groups to resource groups? How am I going to put in some of the metadata and maybe some of this consistency that I need with naming standards, tagging policies, those types of things that we'll talk about in these sections. All the way down into subscription design. Am I a small organization that needs one subscription, never knew I needed multiple? Do I actually need multiple, or am I an organization that's got a lot of complex activities, multiple different things going on, and I would benefit from having multiple subscriptions and some segmentation and cross management of it? Landing zones is the evolved term for the enterprise scaffold that helps us build that framework for decision making along the way, but also putting in those key components that apply to us so that we can build a successful cloud strategy that helps us get it right the first time, but also provides that blueprint for how things will change, how decisions will be made, how decisions will change, policies, all of those different things as we get into governance and we start talking about the results we want, which is predictable cost. We want it to be policy oriented so that the 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 things that Azure can do is narrowed down to the 3 things I need it to do for my business. How can we ensure that our identity controls are safe so that, you know, when we all go to bed at night, we're confident we've done everything to stop attacks, stop breach, stop identities. You know, identities at the forefront now that identities moved outside of the firewall. So how do we secure that and make sure that we're not giving away the keys to the kingdom, so to speak? And then ultimately, how do we monitor that? Not only monitoring the technology efficiency, you know, do I have enough compute, storage, and RAM? Am I up to date and all of those things? But how do we monitor compliance? How do we monitor cost? How do we monitor our identity and bring all that together? We'll touch on some of that. So when we talk about the goals of a landing zone, it's really to provide that framework, as we mentioned. So structure is another word we can use for that. So the kind of questions that you ask yourself going across that top row are, what type of compute will be utilized? What type of storage will be utilized? What networking services, tools, architecture, et cetera, will be available? What type of databases will be used to house data? And this landing zone architecture isn't cloud-wide. It can be in certain cases, but typically isn't. If you're deploying let's say if we're going to deploy a traditional web application that has an IaaS front end, a SQL database, and some middle application servers, the conversation and the answers to those questions are going to be different. The policies we're going to assign to those resources are going to be different than, let's say, if we were deploying something common like a virtual desktop environment. And the idea there is when you create this decision logic, you can simply and effectively make those policy decisions along the way for those various use cases and segment those various use cases to create maximum efficiency, simplicity, and effectiveness when it comes to cost and things like that and compliance in the cloud. So it's on me to convince you of that. I know, as I mentioned earlier, and I'm going to deliver on this promise, it's really high level and there's a lot of complex topics. This is a rabbit hole that goes pretty deep, but you know, what the goal of this conversation will be is to convince you that taking these steps to do this planning is essential to all the things we want on the back end, which is no surprises in a best practices environment. So an example of this, and there are many, many, many examples. So I pulled one that I like to use because I think a lot of people understand it, is you know, a decision tree based on compute considerations. So if we're looking at the chart we just presented, that top left corner, there's the decision tree. There's decision trees we can create and simplify for compute, network, storage, and data. And I'll try to make this as applicable as possible, which is when we walk in and say, okay, we need to know what kind of compute we're going to use in the environment. The goal of this decision tree at the end is to use things from number 8 on the right, policy, use things from number 7 on cost management, use things from number 9, identity and monitoring, as well as everything along the right side to ensure that once we make a decision about how something's going to run, that grouping of resources or that area of Azure or in Azure entirely, if that's all that we're doing, does that and only does that. So when you first spin up a subscription, you can spin up a virtual machine. You can spin up Azure App Services, Azure Functions, container instances, Kubernetes. You can do all of these different things. But as we go through this logic, it's ideal not only from what you can do and, you know, getting all the alerts and saying, nope, that's excluded by policy, but actually filtering portal.azure.com for your administrators to only see the things that you want them to be able to do within those segments of the cloud that they're in. So when we go through here and we say, okay, we're going to deploy a web application. Does this web application exist today on premises? Maybe it's somewhere else. Is it new? If we're going to migrate it, is it a lift and shift operation, meaning like it's already optimized and we know how it needs to run, it's on these servers and that's the only way it can be? Or can we optimize it? If we can optimize it, do we move it kind of along the logic and maybe it's suitable for an Azure App Service? Maybe the database, when we talk about get out of compute, maybe the database is suitable for Azure SQL databases or Postgres or Oracle or any of the other database services, Cosmos DB, some of these different things that can service applications. Can it be contained? These questions that we want to ask to kind of go through so that we end up with the decision of exactly what compute we need. And then I'll talk here shortly about how we drill that into further down into things like policy and enforce that, so that once we know that we're going to use Azure virtual machines, and it's going to be backed by a SQL database as a service, networking connectivity is between those is going to be the Azure backplane, and we're also going to have some Azure file storage off to the side for general file storage for that application to access. We can set Azure very simply to say, this is this application, these are the resources, this is what we want to do, which will ultimately prevent things like cost overruns, bad configurations, attaching, common things like, is this an internal application or an external application? If it's an internal application, then the short answer is it never needs a public IP address. So let's exclude that to make sure that doesn't accidentally happen, so that we can't, maybe we were making some firewall changes and things like that, and all of a sudden accidentally expose our application to the internet in a way that it shouldn't be. So that's what these decision logics are for, and looks really, really complex on the page, but the idea there, as we go through the different services that you deliver to the organization, kind of walking through these decision trees and answering some of these easy questions helps you narrow down the scale of all the different options, the literally thousands of configurations of compute you can deliver from the cloud down to the ones that you need. And then combining that with good collected data and metrics and some planning, we can narrow it down further into the ones that are most efficient for you. So let's focus on the primitives a little bit. We're going to walk around and talk about management groups, resource groups, naming standards, and subscriptions in the next one. So in the next ones, but kind of want to focus on this blade of this section of it, understanding that we just talked about compute. Those same decision trees as well as additional decision trees exist. So when we have those conversations, depending on the conversation that we need to have based on your requirements, we will kind of pick different decision logic and start to move through that quickly. But when we talk about the primitives, what we're really talking about is what is the structure. So going back to the scaffolding example, like, what does this framework need to look like? What needs to be in place and how does it need to be managed? For most organizations that are smaller, management groups may not be relevant. It may be something that you have one of because you have one management group, maybe one or two subscriptions, and you have a small IT team that kind of wears many hats and does it all. For complex organizations, separation of duties is critical. So what the goal of a management group is to do is to organize subscriptions at the highest level and plays that fundamental role in role-based access controls to build that manageable long-term strategy. So when we talk about management groups, we'll talk about some different ways in which you can do that, some common areas, but there's about 9 of them. Won't go through them all, but there's about 9 of them that we can do. I'll also note that when we get into the section around policy is assignable to the management group. So the idea that management groups are at the top of the hierarchy. So therefore, that's our first place to be able to apply policy. So when we talk about our decision logic prior, if we determine that there's these 4 services and only those 4 services that your cloud needs and will ever need, or at least for now, what we'll do is we'll create a policy that is inclusive of those 4 services, but exclusive of all other services. And instantaneously, what we've done is told Azure that the 2,996 other things you do are irrelevant to my business. So I want to focus on these 4, which helps you not only enforce when people are creating things and changing things. It literally won't allow you to do it if you want it to. It can just send audit alerts and things like that if someone does something out of bounds, depending on how you want to set it. But it can mold the environment that you're looking at to simplify it for you. And again, whether this is in the data center, this rings true. This is in the data center in the cloud. It's definitely more important in the cloud because of kind of like the always connectable, the exposed identity. I mean, there's exposed identity in data centers today with cloud-based identity and some of those things, but it is extremely important to always separate duties and only grant enough access to Azure resources for those who need it. Even if that person, the physical person, like Jason, is the only IT administrator within the organization, it is still vitally important that I do different jobs through different virtual contexts, meaning user logins, passwords, and things like that, to not give one identity too much password or too much access, other than some what we would call break glass type of counts that are heavily audited, that go through multi-factor authentication and nobody uses unless there's a fire, right? So separation of duties, separation of resources is something we'll talk about. Jesus will get a lot into that in the actual physical security constraints as well. So management groups, again, just to drive this home, it's a logical thing that organizes subscriptions into containers and allows you to properly start to structure how everything is from the top level all the way down to the bottom level, which is the resources you're deploying. And the same way, the analog for this is the same way you create resources and groups with inside of Active Directory or your identity structure. Everybody generally knows that it's easier to put people as members of groups and assign policies to groups. Same thing exists in Azure. It's easier to put people into resource groups, subscriptions, and management groups, and assign policies at the different hierarchies so that they're scalable and managed and consistent. If you immediately assign those policies at the leaves of the tree here, at the resources, then you'll lead to inconsistency, gaps in your security, gaps in your configuration that can create some complexity, particularly when you're making changes, rolling out, or security gaps. Azure resource groups are another level down, well, let's say 2 levels down. So if we're looking at this design here, right, you got management groups, you've got subscriptions. Don't worry, we're coming back to subscriptions. And then we got resource groups. Resource groups are simply logical groupings of resources. So great example of this using our web application. That's our client, what we'll call it our client website. I'll keep going back to this example. It's a web application, it's an application server, and it's a SQL database. And it's our website, and that's where our clients log in. They manage their stuff. We deliver them a bunch of marketing content. It's our website's a 3-tier application. We've built it in house, and we're hosting on VMs. Probably not the way you want to do it these days, but it's a simple example. A resource group would example of that would be those 3 or however many servers that was. We would wrap in a resource group, and we would call it company website, right? Maybe when we get to naming standards and things like that, we would name it something along the standards, but something very intuitive, very understandable, the company website. The purpose of this is when we apply policy, we can also do that at the resource group level. So I can say the company website has these additional policies associated with it that differ from the core. But I also, when I get into things like cost management, I can say, tell me how much the company website costs, or build a budget for the company website and alert me as we're approaching that budget, or if for some reason we've exceeded that budget. So all the governance, controls, cost management, and monitoring capabilities are there. Or even like when we're in things like Azure Sentinel, the ramifications go throughout the entire environment, and it's saying, okay, we're getting security alerts on this web server. This web service, what you can say then is, we're getting security alerts on your company website, and it's infinitely more human readable. You can dive directly to the problems, drill down into the issue, and understand the criticality of a need in more layman's terms, but do some of these logical groupings along the way. So when we look at on the other side, like when we look at the other side of this, not just being able to visualize information, but how it actually organizes. The idea there is that there's 3 main scopes, with really the management groups over top of that, which is your subscription level, your resource group level, and then your resources. The idea there, when you get into things like role-based access controls, as depicted in the bottom left graphic, is that these resource groups become areas of where you actually apply group permissions, and this is a common framework for how to apply permissions to things. Like if it's a subscription or a resource group, you might have some readers. Like, typically organizations that we're helping will grant us reader access to their subscriptions so that they know we're not making changes, but we can go in there and see all the stuff, start collecting data, assist them with things. And then they can elevate those permissions for us when needed, when we actually have change controls and all of that stuff that we'll talk through in security. But there'll also be some resource specific custom roles, maybe some contributors, people that actually need to make changes, or owners. We'll talk about owners and permissions a little bit about exactly how to do that. But that's the guidance that we'll always provide is when we get down to the resource level, there are no unique permissions in your environment, right? Automated processes will be there. So if you have things like service accounts that go specifically to certain resources, or service accounts that are required for the communication, that's where you want to apply those. So we can talk a little bit about how to plan and build a role-based access control strategy across these different layers. So kind of before we move on, pretty simple so far. Again, like I mentioned, this is going to be really high level. We're going to get into some more of the technical things in the future presentations, but management groups, highest level, resources groups, lowest level of grouping that you're really going to have in the environment above the actual resources themselves. Both are critically important to monitoring as well as maintaining security at scale. Naming tags and standards. The cool thing the way I would say this and kind of advise organizations, Microsoft publishes the latest standards. You can see that directly in the bottom left corner. There's a whole guide on, naming conventions, length of namings, what they advise you put in there. I highly recommend that you follow that. It's future-proof by design. And I also would highly suggest that what you do on premises today and the limitations in which you have for naming virtual machines and applications and things that have been limited by directory length names and Active Directory over the years, you've got to kind of leave that behind and go for more descriptive policy or more descriptive naming conventions, because you have a lot more space to be able to describe things. The standards, we'll talk about that as well, specifically where you want to do that and how you want to architect it. But also you have a lot more ability to associate metadata with things, particularly with tagging resources, so that your environment resources can be filtered, described, and presented in layman terms to not only just technical people that typically probably wouldn't struggle with that because they built the environment, they know how it works, but also when it goes up to the accounting department and they're receiving the Azure bill and they have to go through and they say, okay, what is eGroup _AZ_01_prod_WS website? I know that because I'm technical. Accounting resource may not mean much to them, right? So if that says eGroup website and that's a collection of resources and it has a cost next to it on the invoice, that's helpful to them. So the way we get there, and it's not just cost, it's compliance, it's all of these different things. The way we get there is by adopting and sticking to, and even enforcing as a matter of policy, naming standards that we want to put on our resources, whether it's a storage account, whether it's an app service, whether it's a Cosmos DB, a data lake, whatever the resource is, we have standards for all of those that we can get the latest standards directly from Microsoft on and adopt those. But also we have tagging policies, things that are important to our business, like what is the class of this resource? Is it production? Is it dev? Is it test? So that when we get into our compliance policies and we're looking at, we have multiple subscriptions, one for production and one for dev test, we have a policy out there that says if anything is running in subscription A that has a tag with a key of classification and it doesn't say production, then we want to flag that on the audit report and wonder why someone created a test resource in the production environment or vice versa in the test dev environment. Those types of things are enabled by proper tagging, and tagging allows you to create key value pairs, but what you want to absolutely have is a strategy. What key value pairs are important to us, and then use the Azure policy engine to enforce that those tags are defined, created, and something is input into those all the time so that people can't bypass the tagging policy by creating resources and not supplying the proper information. One of the ways, there's going to be a couple ones here, and I'm going to show you kind of both of these in tandem. When we talk about subscriptions, and I left this for last intentionally, I want to go back up to this slide where we talked about management groups, subscriptions, resource groups, and resources. Resource groups, collection of resources, management groups, collections of subscriptions. So when we talk about subscriptions, there's about 9 popular ways to do this. I don't, but there really could be infinite ways depending on what your business is trying to accomplish. Understanding how many subscriptions you need is a unique conversation to your organization. If you have a very small environment, you may only need one, and you can have network segmentation and all that things to be able to provide the security and everything that you want. But if you have a complex organization with many thousands of people, maybe different lines of businesses, maybe you're a SaaS provider that's delivering 8 applications to your end users, you're going to need a lot more than one. So understanding how to organize them is really, really important. So the first thing you're going to want to do there, and we can discuss, is figuring out what's the model that you want. Is it by workload? So when we talk about by workload, if you're that SaaS organization and you have 7 to 8 different lines of business applications that you're delivering to your clients, maybe they all work together, but they're 7 different specific applications, then what it would make sense is to potentially have one management group for production, one management group for test, dev, QA, and kind of some of those things, and then have 7 different subscriptions for these different line of business applications that ensured segmentation or had very explicit rules about how those shared information with it. That helps not only from a network security manageability, because maybe application team A needs to work on that, but they don't ever even need to know B, C, D, E, F, G even exist when they're logging into their Azure environments and doing their work. Or if they create a script, you want ultimate confidence that, hey, they're only going to work there. That's where that segmentation happens, so that when we provide role-based access controls and policy, as you can see in the blue section of the bottom left, it applies only to that management group, only to those subscriptions within it. So one way is to do it by workload. Another common way is to do it by application category. Right. So we were talking about, hey, we're not a SaaS provider. We're running a corporate IT organization. And within that, we have production development and QA, and we have application services and different things like that we deliver to the business as part of production. Only a handful of those actually have development or QA environments, right? Maybe one of them's, a vendor application. A couple of them are ones we've built in-house, common with financial, legal, healthcare organizations, to kind of have that mixed architecture. Maybe some of them are mission critical, some of them are not. Some of them are like super secure data. So when you're thinking like mission critical, then we're thinking about topics like disaster recovery. Having your mission critical applications in a separate subscription than your just general applications may be a way that you can go about it, because at that point you can then say, hey, everything in this subscription needs to have highly available DR and needs to be replicated to multiple regions within Azure, and we can ensure that that's there, and that when a workload is introduced there, if it doesn't have those capabilities, we can flag that and understand why it wouldn't. Or if it's in the protected data segment, think like kind of 3-tiered data center architectures where you have a DMZ, you have a general population kind of network, and then you have the secure data network with firewall sitting in between them. This is our bunker data. One of the great things I always say here is when you're doing backups, why have your backups in the same subscription, same networks, same accessible areas with the same admins as the actual production data? It's a really simple step to create another subscription under the hierarchy, put that under separate and limited management with tight lockdown policies, and have your workloads back up to that separate environment completely under different management. And even if it's the same person, different logins, simply because, the easy answer is if subscription A is compromised, then you can have some relative confidence that your subscription B, which has the backups for subscription A, it takes an extra step to compromise that as well, and it reduces your risk simply by making those decisions on the front end without adding additional complexity. So kind of going by application category, going by use case, how do you design those, understanding that. The goal of this, there's other ones. There's business unit design, like, we have HR applications, we have finance, we have different things along those lines. There's infinite ways in which we can set up subscriptions. You can do it based on, these are my platform as a service, this is my VM network, because these things are a little bit different and they need to be managed differently. But the goal at the end of the day, for what we've been talking about for the first 30 minutes or so of this presentation, has been really just honing in on, how do we create a strategy for organizing our information, again, back to these primitives. Because once we do this, and this can be a 5-minute conversation, depending on complexity of your business and what your needs are, or it can be like a multi-week, multi-month effort to get this right. If you're at the hyperscale level, it's everywhere in between. Having the right framework, that right scaffold in there, allows all the other things that we're going to talk about coming up here when we talk about actual governance, which is the things that you want to get out of that structure and the things that we hear organizations struggling with all the time. I'm surprised by cost. How do I, and it's not always that, or how do I manage costs? I don't understand my costs. I don't understand where my dollars are going. Those are kind of the common questions we get. Without the first stuff, it's hard to really derive that. It typically starts back to that question. How do I plan for future costs? But one of the good ones that you hear all the time that's not a negative is like, how do I become more efficient with my costs, right? Where am I leaking costs? Having that scaffold in place is important. If you don't have the framework, the scaffold in place, applying policy becomes challenging and it becomes inconsistent. So when you have the structure in place, it's really easy to say, okay, I need to start creating my policies, my initiatives, and what Azure calls blueprints. There's pre-built policy packages that are designed for compliance that get you like 90% of the way there, that you can fine tune for your organization. Say something like, okay, I'm a hospital and I'm concerned about HIPAA regulations, or I'm a financial institution and I'm concerned about PCI. So when I look at that, there's certain things that I need to meet: encryption standards, network segmentation standards, identity standards. There's a lot of different things that we're going to have to meet along those lines. It becomes a conversation of what are those policies that we're wanting to put in place to meet our compliance and the monitoring standards, and at what level, management group down to resource group, do they need to be applied to create that mix and match, the same way you would design, these are my domain admins and these are my users inside of your Active Directory user environment. Again, having that framework leads to success here. Without it, this can be a very, very challenging thing, or at best incomplete. Like you'll see some things where you can't get the level of detail you need, or you can't get the right precision you're looking for when trying to look at auditing compliance and some of those things. So governance is an often wrongly used term, right? So the way I like to describe this is going back to what I was initially talking about. The Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework is focused on establishing landing zone governance, so that when you create these landing zones, you build that framework that you can govern them. And the goal of this, again, is to aid your organization in managing scale, if that's important, ensuring security, that's important to everybody, and delivering sound cost management, which is also important to everybody. So when we talk about governance, the first conversation for those IT people in the audience is a lot like a disaster recovery policy. Is what is the policy? Is simply the question that we ask. Like, what are the risks that the risks are questions we can ask, but what is the policy? Like, what is the level of standard that we need to meet, that Azure needs to meet for your environment? What are the, based on the risks we know, what does it mean? Like, how highly available does an application need to be? What level of encryption does it need to go to? What are the backup policies? Like, how far back do we need to go? What is the recovery point, recovery time objectives? All of these things, like asking and understanding what the business policy is outside of a technical conversation, is the first step. And then understanding what is our process going to be to monitor this. So we're going to work towards this policy and we're going to work to meeting this. Is this a monthly audit compliance check? Is this a weekly kind of system? Is it a real-time management system? Are we trying to meet annual, external audits? Understanding, what is the process for validating and kind of adhering to corporate policies lead into what are the 5 disciplines of good governance in the cloud, which is cost management. We'll talk about that next. Jesus will talk about kind of security baselines, but we'll get into it a little bit. Resource consistency. If you kind of been divining what I've been saying about the framework before and kind of being able to use policy to filter resource groups and say that, going back to our decision logic tree of an application, these applications are going to be VMs, database is going to be on SQL paths, we're going to have some application servers. Resource consistency is created by enforcing policy on which resources can be utilized. Identity baselines, Jesus will talk a little bit about that, understanding like how identity works. And then all that leads to deployment acceleration, which goes into probably one of the things that we see less often used, which is infrastructure as code, using standardization, using deployment templates, taking the time to not point, click, 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 but to have established workflows for how you deploy new workloads and do that in as an automated process as possible to promote consistency throughout the environment. It starts with kind of, those that are developers or, have been developers will understand the concept of MVP. What's even moved into, kind of business speak for, how do I get this thing off the ground as fast as I can with the minimum parts that are required to be initially successful. So understanding that you cannot do everything we just talked about initially. The things that you have to do are establishing an identity baseline. Again, security is at the forefront of everything we do. Security baseline, security is at the forefront of everything we do. I cannot stress that enough, that security has to be the first consideration. And this is from an application developer, not a security guy. And then deployment acceleration, that in corporate policy implementation. That last one is kind of ambiguous, but what that means is deciding how we're going to introduce new workloads into the cloud. Are we going to use ARM templates, automation tools, Terraform, things like that to be able to do it? Are we going to allow people to go into portal.azure.com and click around and add new workloads? Understanding how we're going to do that, going through those policy considerations so that we can understand exactly what the cloud needs to do. Before you get started, these are the core things that you want to settle on, so that before you even deploy your first workload, the environment is secure and it's tailored to just what you need it to be. And then as you go through things, what you'll find is there will be exceptions in the rules. Maybe it's something comes up, new application, new security, someone has a new requirement. How do you go through these iterations of policies? How do you go through changing your security baseline and measuring the risk for what it means to your data? How do you go through, evolution of resource consistency? What that means is we initially decided what we need Azure to do, or maybe a year or two down the road, or we've got a new workload. And all of a sudden, this new workload, we went through all the decision logic that we established quickly and understood that it needs this service to be successful, but that's excluded due to policy. How do we go about updating our policies to allow that? Where does it fit into our hierarchy of management groups, subscriptions, and resource groups? And, at what granular level? Is it something that we're completely transforming and we want to allow that at the management group level so that it's available throughout the entire organization? Or do we want to just allow that in one resource group because that's the only place it's going to be utilized? Those types of things, going through these evolutions. The purpose of this depiction is to talk about it's not just creating that minimal viable product, but it's establishing individuals that are responsible for cloud governance ensuring that they're connected to the people, and this could be the same person, right? So, or group of people that are connected to the people that are talking about the strategy, understanding what the future of the business is and what it needs, as well as being well ahead of the people responsible for adoption. And adoption's just in this framework is just a fancy word for the people that are actually, turning the screwdrivers and making things happen, so that governance can stay at the forefront, making sure that policies and things like that evolve to stay ahead of the business's requirements, and ensuring that what happens is you don't get straight to adoption. You end up with a business impacting event like, we've got to get this thing out, we got to get it out this week. So away with the governance policy, remove the restrictions, we've got to get this done in the name of satisfying our clients. So a little bit of framework there that we can walk through. But again, when I talk about simplicity, it's not hard to talk about identity, security, and how we're going to deploy things and what we're going to deploy. Implementing those as a baseline is a fairly simple task, accomplished in hours and days. And then talking about how we're going to go about change management is really what all these fancy words are on the page for. And if you've done all this right, meaning you have a good hierarchy, you have tagging, you have resource groups that are intuitively named and meet the standards and do all of that stuff, then cost management becomes a very beautiful picture, where oftentimes it's frustrating for those that are typical looking at it, capital expenses on premises with some ongoing support expenses and things like that, and trying to do 5-year, 10-year TCOs on infrastructure solutions, and trying to wrap their heads around what it is, kind of this resource as a service. I can spend anything I want or spend as little as I want type model. If you've put all that thought into place, you have a good policy for change management, you have the framework. We have tags that maybe say cost center, and then have the cost center that resource group or resource is identified to in there. It becomes very easy for you to build reports, visualizations, and Power BI within cost management, corporate dashboards, to day in and day out, up to the minute, monitor your cloud spend to understand where the dollars are going, attribute those dollars to the success of the solutions that, we'll go back to the 7 line of business apps. We're spending more on, application 7, but application 2 is our least costly, but delivers more of our revenue, right? Greater profit. So, where can we make optimization decisions to kind of really understand, let's put our money where it matters the most. Let's put our security, all those different things where it matters the most. All of this stuff kind of falls out of a proper design. Where organizations fall into the trap is they deploy all their Azure resources, and then they deploy cost management, and they see their subscription in there, and the data doesn't mean much to them. It's very high level. It's talking about, kind of very technical terms. It's talking VM names and things like that. It's not logically grouped. It doesn't really give you what you need, right? So, which doesn't allow you to do some of the proactive data analysis, and really doesn't allow you to simply visualize where your dollars are going, so that you can make intelligent decisions on how to optimize that and become a more profitable business. We've talked about policy indirectly, and I brought back this one screenshot. So one of the things that won't go too much into this, I think policy makes a lot of sense. For those, I'll keep using the IT example, because I know a lot of the audience we have is in IT administration or has a background for that. Azure policy is very analogous to group policy. When we talk about desktops, this is what we want end users to be able to do. This is what we don't want them to do, right? You can write information to your C drive, or you can't. Very black and white type things along those lines, in a hierarchical standpoint of, does it apply to servers or does it apply to users? The same way we've always done it with group policy inside of domain controllers. Azure policy's no different. It just talks about management groups, subscriptions, resource groups, and resources, and has policies around what services can be deployed, right? If we're building a web application, we can get granular and say, within this resource group, The only VM that can be provisioned is a D2v2 VM that has, 4 cores and 8 or 7 gigs of RAM, and that's it. If someone tries to upgrade that or downgrade that, they can't. It can be things along the lines of, like a little bit more multi-layered, where you can say things like every disk in this environment has to be encrypted. A VM cannot be created without an encrypted disk. Or it can be things like one of the ones I like kind of as a restrictive policy, because I see the ramifications of not doing it quite often, which is this network can or cannot have a public IP address. Because a lot of VM templates in the marketplace come with a public IP address already attached to them, which step 2, if you're going the point and click method as opposed to the automated method we were talking about, which will end up happening as we go into an organization, you'll see a lot of VMs with public IPs that people didn't really know were there. And then you immediately go into the audit logs of those VMs and you see a lot of brute force attempts to break local administrator passwords, right? So, and that can obviously lead to significant ramifications. So some of those things, down to like thousands, if not tens of thousands of granular policies, we can apply. But the good news is, when we're talking about the Azure Policy Engine, it does 2 things primarily. One of it is it prevents, right? So you can say something cannot be done, whether via code, via the interface, or any means possible, unless it meets these standards. And that can include things like encrypted disk and public IPs, but it can also say, like, this resource, we're not even talking about VMs, like it could be an Azure App Service, a Cosmos DB, it has to have this tag associated with it. It has to have a value for this. You can even use it as automation. You can say as policy, if it doesn't have a tag, associate it to this, so that automatically what ends up happening is a compliance policy will pick that up and say, we've got 4 services out in Azure that don't have this as a resource or as a tag categories because they fell into this default bucket. Let's go see who the owner of that is, another great tag to have, and reach out to them and tell them to, get them to update their information accordingly, or we're going to shut that resource down, if you want to take a kind of a policy. But the goal is, it allows you to establish control, be proactive in preventing drift by enforcing policy, kind of making sure everything is as it should be, enforcing people to come ask questions if they need to do something that falls outside the lines, but also enables everything from Azure Compliance to Azure Security Center, we'll talk about in the monitoring section, to actually validate your compliance. Because if you don't have any policies and you go into your compliance portal, nothing's going to validate or violate those policies, so everything's automatically going to be within compliance. This is going to be the fast one, because I know Jesus is going to cover this in depth, but the one thing I always want to touch on when we talk about identity management as a core component of governance is having a very consistent way in which you not only separate roles across owners. The idea there for a subscription is the rule is always you should have 2 owners. You should have never more than 2, and those accounts should really never be used, and other than very, very sparing situations where you're actually doing subscription management. Most of your work should be done with contributors. You can see that contributors, those are people that are actually changing stuff or have the potential access to change stuff. We'll get into privileged identity management and potential versus actual in the future, but those should be at the resource group level. And that can be pretty simple, it can be pretty complex, but not having contributors at the subscription level reduces your risk. You can have readers at the subscription level. That's where the people that are kind of watching things, that's where you want to put them. And then on down the line, there's infinite resources to kind of lay this out. But the important thing we want to talk about in creating an Azure blueprint and helping you get cloud right the first time is, what does your organizational structure need to be for role-based access controls? Whether you're 1 person in IT or whether you're 500, the strategy is the same. It's just different accounts with a different number of people playing different roles. All right, and then last thing I'll say, it's in words, but it's worth repeating, is that when we talk about modern IT, identity is the new firewall. Most most organizations, not all, have some level of cloud. They have something outside the firewall that has a username and password for a business use. Most commonly, Azure AD, Okta, on down the line, different identity providers that you can have. Identity is now outside the firewall. So I always make the joke, we can have the best network security, we can have the best, firewalls and intrusion prevention detection systems, all of these great things in our data center, our cloud, in our SaaS applications. But if you leave the drawbridge down and the gate open, they're not doing you much good. So you can be compromised. So identity has to be something that is treated just as important as security. It needs to be managed by the secure people responsible for security within your business. And then when we talk about monitoring, the great news, again, when we talk about governance, if we did bullets number 1 through 5 right, these become really easy. Azure monitoring, the policy and compliance engine, when we talk about overall secure score, that's not exactly the same as like an Office 365 secure score we were talking about yesterday. It can be tailored to meet your business. Like, what are my compliance requirements? What are the things that I'm going to be deploying? What are the policies I have, so that you can achieve 100% compliance. And the thing about that is, throw that up on the dashboard, and then if someone spins up a resource or something changes with the resource, and you see 98% compliance there, you can drill into that and then drill into the application all the way down to where that compliance was violated. Maybe a VM was spun up without an encrypted disk, or, to use the example earlier, a production VM was spun up in a test environment, or vice versa. We violated compliance, so now we have a clear, measurable statistic to aim towards day in and day out. That can roll up into everything when we're talking about SIEM and automated response systems with Azure Sentinel. That can roll up into things like ensuring that things are protected, data protections there, ensuring things are up to date, patched, deployed, both in the cloud as well as across data centers. Between the Azure Monitor capabilities and the compliance engines in place, as well as Azure Sentinel, to be able to ingest data from all different aspects as a SIEM tool, as well as automatically respond to those. You have a full engine available to simplify your auditing and monitoring of your environment, so that you can kind of have a daily check, go in there, okay, everything still looks green across the board. Things will clearly stand out. Or in the event something is happening, for example, inside of like Azure Sentinel, we've detected 3 risks with your website. If we've done the proper naming standards, tagging, all of those things become very intuitive, which allow us to react extremely quickly to responses and intuitively to them, so that we can say, okay, something's going on with the website, let's dig in, and we don't figure out a bunch of time trying to figure out what's what and how far it's spread. So again, I'll leave you with this. The last thing, what I want to talk about here, and I'm going to go back kind of to the beginning while Jesus is getting ready to transition. All of these things we want to talk about in this kind of context. This can be, a short discussion for simple environments. It's easy to talk. If you've got 100 VMs in your environment, then we know how to back those up. We know how to protect those, and it's not super complex. And there's not a lot changing, all the way to I'm a hyperscale SaaS provider, and we're doing all these things, and we're constantly rolling out new solutions, and we're staying ahead of the game. Like, the framework adjusts to the level of business you are, and the time you have to spend planning and implementing it also scales to that time as well. So if this sounds like a lot to you, don't let it. It can be a very simple conversation, but when it needs to be, it scales to the very complex. With that, Jesus, I will turn it over to you. Well, let's hold true to the schedule. It is 10:15 Eastern time now. Let's take a break and plan on being back at 10:20, where Jesus is going to take us from the clouds, pun intended, high-level stuff, down into some more specific stuff when we talk about actually implementing and security controls. on break till 10:20. All right, well, we'll get back started here. Jesus, I'll turn it over to you to let you do a quick introduction and take us away.
All right, thanks, Jason. All right, good morning, everyone. So we're going to get down a little bit deeper than where Jason was this morning. We're going to start getting into the focus around security here with Microsoft Azure. Do a brief introduction of myself here next, and then we're gonna dive into the Azure benchmark and what that actually is. We'll leave time for some Q&A at the end if we have anything there. And then my outro is really Jason's next intro for the last section of our sessions this morning. So I'm Jesus again. I'm Director of Cloud Services here at eGroup. I've been with eGroup well over 8 years now, and previously, before moving up into this role, I was in a solution architect role. I have a deep technical background on the Microsoft stack, and especially here on the cloud. If you were here with us yesterday, we had a lot of similar conversations on the security side about Microsoft 365. We're going to skew this one towards Azure. And they're both Microsoft Cloud, so having some overlap there is not coincidence, right? It's on purpose. They have a lot of shared assets between the two, and they work congruently. So I'll highlight some of that as we go along. So jumping in, the Azure Security Benchmark covers a few different areas, and we're going to get into these here in a little bit of detail, and I'll show you where they are lined up in there. But you can see that most of these areas that we've highlighted here are also things that we just talked about earlier when we're talking about designing, our deployments and how we're going to lay things out, because they're all related. They work hand in hand. So a lot of this is probably not new for a lot of you that have been in IT. Of course, we have a lot of these similar concepts that we've had to apply regardless of where our services and infrastructure resided. So this framework that Microsoft has put together, again, it's a framework. It's meant for you to look at the controls and the suggestions and then make a determination if it's best for your environment. But they have taken their best practices here that they've presented it as some place to start with, and they've mapped this out to common controls. So CIS, for instance, they produce a variety of different controls for different technologies for you to implement to secure your infrastructure and services. So in this case, they actually do have one for Azure, and Microsoft's taken, worked with CIS in creating that, and they've also taken that and mapped it to their kind of getting started, their benchmark security framework here. They do produce a document that actually maps to those controls. So they will say which ones of these Microsoft controls map to these CIS controls. So if you're using CIS, you can translate those back and forth. They also have one that maps to 800-53, the NIST standard there. Oddly enough, both of these are kind of two different frameworks. CIS is much more granular and explicit in terms of the controls that it enables, whereas the 853 is more conceptual, and it's basically considered the granddaddy of your security, and risk management frameworks. In between there are things like ISO 27001s. We have the NIST CSF, and some other smaller NIST frameworks that you could also follow that you may be implementing as well. Now, while Microsoft doesn't have a one-to-one mapping on those frameworks, a lot of those organizations that manage the frameworks actually provide mapping back to, say, 853 or CIS, which you can walk back and do those crosswalks between those if you're using those frameworks as well. So last, we're not really going to touch it here today, and we didn't go over it yesterday, but inside of Microsoft 365, they do have a compliance score, kind of like Secure Score. It essentially gives you control mappings for some of these other environments to different Microsoft areas. Now, they don't necessarily cover them, one-to-one, meaning they might publish the framework and guidance for a Microsoft 365 service, but it may not exist for Azure or vice versa. But that is a resource that's out there available for everybody that has a Microsoft subscription there. So you could use that kind of to balance that out. Now, that being said, before we jump into these different areas on the benchmark, and we talk about Azure, just like with Microsoft 365, I will say that starting with Secure Score, if you don't have anything right now, is a great place to start, because it's going to have the general guidance for getting in and putting things in place. that are considered wide practices, best practices that can be applied to the majority of organizations that deploy their cloud services. Things like enabling MFA on your privileged accounts, limiting privileged accounts, and so forth. Those will be captured in there. And the security benchmark here is actually being applied inside Azure as the default compliance and policy framework that gets enabled on new Azure subscriptions as well moving forward. So even out of the box, it's going to start measuring against some of these controls we're going to look at. So the first one here that Microsoft has here is the network security, right? They've listed 7 controls here. And if you look at these, I mean, it's nothing here that's out of the ordinary that we wouldn't see when we're managing networks anywhere else, right? How do we want to separate our internal traffic? Where are we doing, our networks? How are they talking to each other? The one that's on here that we'll look at, but establish private network access for Azure services. That one's an interesting one, kind of specific to Azure, because a lot of services by default are available through a public interface. So when we talk about like storage accounts, for instance, which are used for logs and VM audit records and so forth, those, when you first spin them up, actually do allow you to access it from a public interface. You have to go in and explicitly say, no, I want to turn that off, and I want to access it only internally from internal networks or from, this private network access feature here, which is an actual feature in Azure that you can deploy. So, network security rules, that's NSGs in Azure terms, as well as like the firewall service, and of course, DNS that's in there. So we'll take a quick look at that. When we look at the development of when we're designing things in those network architectures, a lot of those same concepts we apply locally move out to Azure as well. So first, if we take a look here, I'm going to share this quick diagram. This is like a conceptual diagram of, a more complex deployment, but it does show what Jason was kind of talking about with landing zones and separation of subscriptions, as well as having our resources in there, including our networks. So in this deployment here, by the way, we'd probably recommend consolidating some of these. So instead of having like 3 separate management networks, we might pull those into one shared network that shares with kind of your application network, and your sandboxes are like your playground for people to try out ideas and things like that. All of these subscription-based deployments on this diagram can actually be replicated, at least partially, inside of a single subscription using resource groups, which are those logical containers that we talked about, right? Because we can actually apply different sets of permissions around assets that are in resource groups, and we can make things visible to people that have those rights inside of that container versus invisible for people outside of those containers and other resource groups. So we can do some logical separations within even a single subscription as well that represents similarly what you see here on the diagram. And down here, you'll see this connectivity subscription. Really, if we think about this as a separate network, this is going to be a network that hosts all of our connectivity interfaces with the outside world, right? So this will be our first kind of network separation here, or network separation boundaries. We're going to put the firewall in here, any VPNs that are out there, that's all going to go here and stay on this network. And then if we have a separate network where we put all our servers and applications, that's going to keep those separate. And then we just peer those networks so they can talk to each other. Now, if anything happens, we can kill the peering automatically and stop anything coming in from the outside world from hitting any of our internal resources. And we can also restrict what's happening across that peer as well. And by doing that, we also gain some additional security controls and monitoring and separation, in some cases, even getting down to like billing and availability. So let me flip that back. All right, just to bring up our security center. So now moving from that and how we apply some of these network controls and what we look at in audit, we would start here in Azure Security Center. This is basically an aggregate view of a lot of the different security controls that come in and gives us alerts and warnings and best practices that we come in here. You'll notice right at the top, we have that secure score that's in here. The secure score, if we click into it, is going to give us those recommendations on what we should do on those subscriptions. I don't have a lot going on here, but if I drill down a bit, I'm going to start getting down into some recommendations here on what we can implement. Now, we had a few in there that are going to be relevant, and I was looking at, oh, this one. So prevent against DDoS attacks, right? So this is going to go kind of in our network controls and what we saw before and how we help with like intrusion detection and IPS. So I can click in here, and on my network where I have that shared network resource, we have all of our public internal stuff coming in. I can enable some advanced DDoS protections on those networks that Microsoft then goes in and applies like machine learning. It starts looking at what the normal traffic is on my networks, and when it sees anomalies, it can start dropping those connections or alerting me to those problems that are in there. So that's what this one actually indicates here. And I can go through here and start enabling those as the recommendations are telling me as I go through here, and developing my security with my deployments along the way, right? So as I deploy new resources, they're going to get evaluated against these rule sets here, and they'll pop up with additional recommendations. And actually, I don't have to pop the screen. This here, you'll see I've got a host of resources that are already deployed. I don't have any VMs currently deployed here, but I have a few networks. This is my shared network. Again, my shared network is actually paired with this network behind the scenes. So I've already got that separation in place. Now, inside of these networks, in order to continue to control the access back and forth, there's a few more resources we can deploy. One are called network security groups. And where are my security groups? I think maybe I didn't deploy that. All right, well, I do have my DDoS protection rule that's actually deployed. And outside of network security groups, I'll open one up and we can look at it. Is an Azure firewall. So the Azure firewall on the network, of course, can also segregate your traffic, both externally to the internally, but you can also route all of your internal traffic through the firewall, just like you would a traditional appliance. Now, you can deploy third-party appliances out here, like a Palo Alto or something like that. They have virtual appliances that go out in Azure. You could do that as well if that's in your ecosystem. But if you're wanting to go, full service-based protection on your network, the Azure firewall can be deployed, and Microsoft manages that as a service. So you don't manage virtual machines from here. You just set up your firewall. You set up your routes to put all your traffic through your firewall, and then set up your inspection rules. With that, just again, as you would in a traditional network. Now, what's nice here is Microsoft handles basically the bursting of traffic, right? If it needs to scale out to handle the traffic that's coming in, that's all done for you. You don't have to worry about it being, saturated. You're not going to hit like CPU ceilings or anything like that. Now, Azure Firewall is still not at the level of what I'd say like a next generation firewall is, like with the Palo Alto, but Microsoft is rapidly making iterations on it to get it up there. Currently, their IDS, right, the intrusion detection and intrusion prevention systems in there, and the logic with that is being rolled out in preview, and we'll continue to see them build on that within the firewall, and we're going to see these integrated into more services. Like when we pick up that data, it goes to log analytics and monitor, and then it'll get evaluated with some machine learning with Azure Sentinel, and that's going to continue to evolve. So that is there, and I was just staring at my security groups. This is why I couldn't believe I missed these before, but these network security groups are a little more granular than that firewall. So just to go back to that diagram, that firewall is really going to encompass an entire network. We're going to have our specific routes that are going to route over our peering out to the internet, and it's kind of going to cover the majority of the traffic. Our network security groups can actually be a little more granular because we can apply those down to a network, a larger like SuperNet, or we can go down to the subnets and apply them there. And you can get all the way down to applying the specific resources. So for instance, a virtual machine can have an NSG applied to its actual network interface card. So you could have different access rules there. Now, a network security group is really going to be about what traffic's allowed, what protocols, what ports. So kind of thinking more like a lack of a better term, think of it more like that port firewall or a dumb firewall, blocks traffic, allows traffic. Now, though you can get really granular on where to place these, I do recommend that actually when you're going out and you're deploying these, that you try to keep them at the highest level possible, right? So, ideally you're going to have networks for resources that are related, that have one set of like access requirements, and you can apply an NSG at the network layer, and then all of those machines that are separated at the subnet level might be able to flow through there. Now, if you need to get more separation there, again, we're talking about blocking that internal east-west traffic, you can then apply them on the subnet. I would definitely try to avoid applying those directly on the virtual machines themselves. Okay, so identity management is really the next tier. So we talked a lot about this yesterday, and this is a big shared area, right? The plane here is Azure Active Directory. It shares that coverage with Microsoft 365. So in order to get access into the Microsoft ecosystem, you're going to go through Azure Active Directory. So all of the same things here actually apply. With Azure here specifically, we're talking about the management plane access by default. So if you're only, say, moving virtual machines into the cloud, you're generally going to be using your Azure AD control for those administrators that have to manage those virtual machines. Now, if you start deploying platform as a service items out there, SQL Server, some of the app services, those are going to start to leverage other identities and what are called like service principals that also reside in Azure Active Directory. Those are essentially going to use the cloud directory to gain access to those resources. So it becomes important to manage and be aware of those as well. You can also utilize, the single sign-on features in there. So if you're developing an app, or in some cases, if you're using a third-party service that deploys into Azure, it might request access. It might want to deploy a service principal itself that's going to be managed to access and writes through your Azure AD, or it might look for a SAML federation in there just for the identity and single sign-ons for access in there. So there's still a lot in common from that standpoint when we're actually deploying Azure versus Microsoft 365. Now, in here, if we open up our Azure Active Directory, I am going to tell you, if you have this and you don't have Microsoft 365, you've generally got a level of Azure Active Directory that won't give you access to things like conditional access rules. So if you weren't with us yesterday or you haven't dove into that, conditional access rules do exactly like they sound. There's basically a condition that you set that allows access to resources. And you can use the power of those to kind of grant and limit access to Azure resources there as well, but that requires a different subscription level to the directory here, which is called Azure Active Directory P1 or P2, than what you get with Azure out of the box. Now, that being said, there is a tool in here when you go in here that's called security defaults that you can enable. And I do recommend this. If you have Azure Active Directory out there, enabling security defaults is going to do things like block what's called legacy authentication. It's going to turn on MFA for privileged access. It's going to turn on MFA really for any users that log in. The prompt intervals that you get for that multi-factor changes whether you have a privileged role or if you're a normal user accessing the portal, which there can be scenarios that users will access the portal here if there's other applications published, or like I said, if they're using some service that passes through and they need access to Azure AD to access those services. So you'll want to protect those as well. And the way you get the security defaults, I'm going to point it out here because it's actually a little hidden. So when we're in Azure Active Directory, you're going to pull that up. We're going to scroll down to properties. And when you first look, it doesn't look like it's actually on here. And it's like I've got my stuck right at the edge. There we go. It is a link right down here. It's not apparent. When you're first looking at it, there's no toggle because you have to hit the link to open it. But now when you open it, you'll see right now this is off. I'll leave it off here so I don't lock myself out of my demo tenant. But when you turn this on and apply it, it's kind of an all or nothing play here. So I definitely recommend turning it on, but do be aware that it does turn those things on like MFA. That's going to be on there. People are going to be prompt to enroll. in there, and it's going to essentially control access of when that gets triggered. So I can't define, that conditional access I was mentioning before, where I could set up the rules. I can't modify these rules. It's what Microsoft puts in place. If you wanted to have more control over this, you would want to move up to those other Azure AD subscriptions, and then you would come in, turn this off, add your conditional access rules in its place. But if you just have Azure today, without Microsoft 365, and you don't have one of those advanced subscriptions, I would say come turn this on for sure. If you have Azure and a Microsoft 365, I still recommend turning this on, but you have to prepare a little bit more because the user office interactions and stuff are going to be affected, so you want to make sure you've planned for that. Now, in here as well, essentially all of our controls are going to be in here from that area we were just looking at. And it's mostly going to be around the security area. Outside of this advanced controls here, if you move down into security in Azure AD, you're going to notice I have an identity secure score down here. A lot of the items that are in here are going to apply to those items that we actually had applied out there on this slide, right? So when we look at these in here, use strong authentication controls for Azure Active Directory-based access. We're talking about MFA there, right? Monitoring and alerting, that's really all set up in here. So under the secure score label here, it will guide you through setting up a lot of these items, and you'll see that they're listed here. So these are the actual technical controls that will map up into these other framework controls. Now, if I move back up, where was my, this is where I was saying conditional access is located. It's also under here, but again, you won't necessarily have access, just like this one right here. I don't have access because my subscription is not at that level. If you see this screen, that's what that means. You're going to want to go back and look at that security defaults. And is there anything on here that I really want to highlight in here? Yeah, actually, these first two are good ones we didn't really speak too much about. When it says here standardized Azure Active Directory as the central identity and authentication system, really for most organizations we run into, they have their Active Directory domain controllers, right, that are syncing to Azure Active Directory. So those kind of become an intertwined entity, and they almost work together to be that central store. So that would fit this paradigm here, because you're going to have AD really as your source of authority, but it's going to sync with Azure Active Directory, and it's going to keep your identities in check there. But you may have other identity systems out there, and especially now with Azure Active Directory, we see VMware Identity Manager, AWS has identity frameworks out there. We see Okta, Ping Identity. So there's a lot of different players in this space that offer the same type of controls here. And so what this really means is you need to settle on one. Of course, this is the Microsoft framework, so it says Azure Active Directory. If you're invested in Okta, then Okta might become your source. But you really want to try as much as possible is to consolidate that down to have your one main identity provider. And what's nice about these industry standards that we have is most of these can work together. So I can take Azure Active Directory, I can federate that with Okta, for instance. And what happens when I sign into Azure Active Directory, it's going to go to Okta for approval and then go back to Azure Active Directory and let me in, or vice versa with some of these different systems. So versus having some things done with Okta, some things done with Azure AD, that kind of defeats the purpose of like the single sign-on, and then we kind of lose that single route for auditing and control and access and reporting and so forth. So the other one, manage application identities securely and automatically. That will happen depending on how you deploy your services. For instance, you can utilize app services in Azure, and you might have a secure identity that will deploy out to what's called a key vault. The key vault is a service in Azure that can store identities, service principals, public and private keys, your certificates, and then those can be securely accessed by resources that need them. So, a lot of times you think when you're doing local scripts and things, on premises, you have to have a way to pass credentials to those scripts. So in the past, we would take those, encrypt them, and store them somewhere, so for reuse as they keep going. that kind of does the same thing here with Key Vault. You can do that in the cloud and tie to the automation technologies as well. A lot of items that you'll see here will have triggers. When we look at the auditing piece, so anything that's generally brought into the log space for Azure services can be tied into some form of automation, because it can actually leverage either Azure automation directly, which is kind of a layer of a service that sits on top of logic apps, and it allows you to take activities out there. That forces the notifications and so forth that can go out, or actual actions that you could do, because you can talk to like the Graph API and literally like block out accounts and so forth. Okay, privileged access. This is a carry-on from our identity access areas as well, right? So here is, we're actually looking at it and saying, how many administrators do we need? So Azure adds a little bit of a layer of complexity here. And Jason alluded to that a little bit earlier. So we have our directory controls in Azure AD, but then we also have a service level of controls inside of Azure. And when we're in there, we can have an identity that has very limited rights inside of the directory. So it can't do things to manage other identities. It's not going to control things like access to applications and so forth. But we can have that limited user be a very powerful user in Azure itself. And Azure has a hierarchy that it follows as well. So when you're granted rights at a higher level, you generally have implicit rights as it goes down. So if I assign rights at the subscription level, everything within that subscription, I'm also going to have rights for, right? So I'm going to go into access control here. And you'll see we have a few things we can check access, but I'm going to go into our role assignments. And you'll see I have an account here with contributor rights, and then we have owner rights. So these accounts, well, anything I deploy into the subscription, they're going to have these rights that cascade down. So if I have somebody that manages everything and needs visibility to anything, I'm going to assign those at the subscription level. And that could be the main administrators that do deploy everything in there. But it could also be security and auditing, legal folks, for instance. They may need to see everything in a subscription as well, but maybe they don't have to change anything. I would still come here and I would give them, say, reader access level controls. They can see everything, but they can't edit or modify or change anything there. And I would do that at the subscription level so they have full visibility into everything. This way, when they go into billing and reports and auditing, they're going to see all of those assets as well. Now, when we go down from a subscription, we could go into resource groups, and that's where we're saying we could separate this. So I can make somebody an owner of a resource group, and they won't have access to other resource groups, right? So I might have a resource group for dev assets. I'm going to give my dev manager owner rights into that. He can deploy networks, he can deploy VMs, he can deploy anything inside that resource group. And he might not see anything in production. We could have the production resource group, and he doesn't have reader rights. He doesn't have any kind of rights over there. He won't even know that exists. It won't even show up here. But, you know, again, it cascades down on his side of things inside of that resource group, where the VMs networks that he creates, of course, he's going to have that full access. Couple of ones that are up here and worth noting out: emergency access to Azure AD. So we call these emergency accounts. And this is important when you set up conditional access rules that might block out access. So when you're designing your security, you want to not just think about the Azure portal access and what you're getting into. There's access through the Azure CLI, there's access through PowerShell, and you can use conditional access there to actually block those rights. But if you turn it on and put everybody in it, and if you select the wrong rules, it's entirely possible to actually lock out your admin accounts, and then you end up having to call Microsoft for them to work out your access to get it back. So we always recommend setting up one, if not two, emergency access accounts. Those generally will have full rights. So to your Azure Active Directory subscription, you don't have to give these rights to Azure, and I'll show you why here in just a second. But they should have full rights into Azure Active Directory so that we can always log in, because that's always the first thing we hit when we're accessing the Microsoft resources here, like Azure or M365. And you want to audit access. That should not be at all used for day-to-day access or anything in there. We should expect that nothing's happening with those accounts. So looking at sign-in logs or having something that flags on these accounts within your logs is definitely important when you have those out there, because otherwise they're going to sit out there and not be used. And you also want to, of course, take that password and you want to save it. And it needs to be a really complex password, because we also don't want this account to be triggered with MFA. We don't want it tied to MFA in case there's an issue with MFA. These are our break the glass accounts. And if I drop down here, I'm going to go, where's my Azure AD? Not many people are aware this exists, but if you have at your Azure Active Directory, it's tied to your Azure subscription, and we go into our user settings, there is, oh, I lost them in the wrong spot. It was actually under properties. Oh, here it is. Yeah, it's under properties. Access management for Azure resources. If I turn this to yes, my account is going to get implicit rights to every subscription tied to this directory. So this is where if I have that break glass account, I don't have to give it rights into Azure, right? Initially, if I need it, I can get in here, I can get into Azure AD, I can turn this on, and then after about 5 minutes, I could actually go into Azure, look at my subscriptions, and I would see every subscription associated with this directory here, and I will have implicit owner rights into those subscriptions. So I can modify permissions, add people, get into there, add myself back in, fix things by doing that. Now, this is a toggle here, so if I say yes, it stays yes. What you'll want to do is actually just definitely remember to come back in and turn that off. This has come in handy multiple times. We've had people with subscriptions that for one or more reasons, the owner left, maybe they had contributors, but now they can't modify access and they weren't sure how to get back in. We can use this level of access to get back in. In some cases, there's been hidden subscriptions where somebody actually had one, it was tied to the directory. They left and now people were trying to figure out how to get access to it. And then we were able to come in, turn this on, everything becomes visible. And then, we add the proper user principals in there that get access and make it visible to others. And let's see, the other one call out, the privileged access workstations. I don't see this one a lot. If you guys aren't aware with this concept, essentially it's a known good workstation, meaning we know it's not compromised. There's no chance of it being compromised. It's not publicly accessible. And that's what we use to manage Azure Active Directory, right? So what you would do is restrict access to the management portal only to connections from this workstation that would then be hosted inside of the network, and you would have another secure access of getting to it, right? And I mean, the extreme version of this is it's actually a physical terminal that you never remote into. You have to go to that physical location to actually get in and access it. I mean, there's different variations of the concept. So data protection here. This one is an interesting one in Azure. Now, I don't have anything in Azure to show you specifically here because it covers quite a few different areas. So if we start up as far as encrypting the information at rest, Azure data stores can all be encrypted, and you can either let Microsoft manage the keys or you can own the keys if it's highly sensitive information. If you have a virtual machine and you want to encrypt that data, you can also do that. Now, it's important to understand your data is always encrypted. So when I deploy a VM, when I have storage, when it's sitting on Microsoft servers, that stuff is encrypted already. But if I want to encrypt it further, I can encrypt it with my own keys, which means I then control access to that. So, regardless of where that data moves. Now, as far as classifying, protecting sensitive data, the monitoring for the transfer of data, there's a variety of different services that come into play here depending on what you need to do. Azure Information Protection is generally associated with the Microsoft 365 side of the house, but they are integrating that now so that it can apply those same classification rules. It's actually in preview to Azure SQL data stores. Now, Azure SQL itself also has data protection classifications there that can protect data, and it's got things like data masking that's in there. It's got rules that can flag it, who can access it, and a variety of different controls that really get very granular on the SQL side of the house. Asset management. Arguably, this one comes first because you can't really manage any of these other things we're talking about unless we know what they are. And when we talked about like that subscription level access controls, like this first one here, ensure security team has visibility into risks. that would be giving them access to things to the security portal in Azure and letting them see all the resources and be able to see the policies. So that would be a scenario where perhaps we want them to have, at minimum, global reader access on my Azure subscription so they can see everything. Now, we might give them additional access into different things where, depending on where they're in control of resources, where like security admin rights that might allow them to get in, adjust NSGs or set up policies themselves and be responsible for that. And we can tweak it based on the actual roles that are needed across those assets. Now, these other ones where we're like use only approved Azure services, the lifecycle, assets, that's more a combination of your management controls, i.e. a policy written document, do this, not that. But you can overlay what are called policies in Azure that can actually restrict this. So Jason touched a little bit on that earlier, but when we go in and set a policy, we can actually restrict what's available to a user to deploy. And what happens when that policy is in place, if a user tries to deploy something that's not in the policy, is they'll go to deploy it, it'll get evaluated against the policy, then the deployment will actually fail, so it never actually gets deployed. It will return a message and it will tell the user, this is per policy not allowed and it won't be deployed. So to take another quick look there, we're going to jump in and see policies. Let me see, pull that. So here we have a specific screen here, and with your Security Center, you can actually get to it as well. But these are the different policies and evaluations that happen here. And I'm going to show you another screen a little bit later that goes more in depth, but essentially a policy is just a specific rule. So I can say, for instance, no public IPs will be in my data network. And then I can apply that to the resource group where that network exists. And if I try to deploy a public IP to anything, whether it's a PAS resource or my VM resource, it's going to block that and not let me have it. Or I might want to say enforce a specific user route or user-defined route on my network when any network's deployed. This might come in handy. Let's say I have a sandbox or a dev environment, but I still want that to go through a central firewall or central network access. So by default, if I set up an Azure network and I put a VM on it and I'm on the VM, it's just going to go out. It goes straight out to the internet. It'll bypass everything. But if I want to see that traffic, then I have to have a route in place. And I can set a policy that says, if a network's deployed, it has to have a UDR. And not only do I audit that, I can actually tell it to create it if it doesn't exist. So I can create the policy that says create if not exist and have that properties for that UDR set up. So that happens when it goes through the audit phase. So now I deploy the network, it audits it, it fails it, it will put the UDR in place automatically. And you can do things like that for backup and generally any type of resource or configuration item in Azure. So they're pretty powerful, and we use them not just in the security and compliance phase, but also in the deployment and control phase, and so forth. Okay, logging, threat detection. So there is a lot of different services and logging in Azure across those resources. When you start turning on resources, there's a basic level of auditing enabled. You generally have to go in and explicitly tell it that you want to enable your advanced auditing, your advanced logging, and that has to go into what's called a log analytics workspace. Now, log analytics workspaces are a consumption-based service, so that's why you have to opt into it, and Microsoft wants you to do that. A lot of the baseline policies that we're looking at, so Azure Security baseline here, or if you enabled some of the frameworks that we'll take a quick look on that in a bit, we'll actually have a rule in there that enables that for all resources. It's going to say they should be enabled that logging so it all goes into the central resource. Once it's in Azure Log Analytics, there's a few things that work inside of that. So Azure Monitor, for instance, is working off that data, and it can present that data both in dashboards, but as well as creating specific events that you can create actions for. So if we think about simply managing VM resources, and if we've got the advanced network and logging enabled on a VM, we're going to say put our CPU utilization, it's going to be pumping that back into log analytics. In Azure Monitor, we can not just look at that point in time, right, which is a line item that says, okay, 10 minutes ago, 90%. 5 minutes ago, 70%. We can aggregate those into a kind of a time series aggregation and then set a threshold that says, okay, if it sets over 90% for over 5 minutes, I want it to alert me. Or it can actually trigger a function that maybe spins up another VM in a scale set or increases the size of a VM automatically, for instance. You can tie your automation into that from Azure Monitor. Now, another side of that, dealing with security, is Azure Sentinel, right? So the Sentinel is a SIEM, so Security Event Information Management System. Basically, it brings in data from all of these Azure resources, but you can also pump in your M365. You can have other network devices, external services. You might even have on-premises networks that you want to put information into that. It will take all of this information in there, and it will run various run books, right, and workbooks on these to do analysis on all of that, and then it will correlate events across all of those resources. So if it notices something, for instance, like a lateral movement happening because somebody logged into a virtual machine, but then logged into different Azure resources and vice versa, it will start putting that together based on the rule sets. And it too can then trigger alerts, recommendations, or automatic remediation, somewhat like Azure Monitor. Now, Sentinel also uses Azure Monitor for all its dashboarding and things like that. So all three of them work together. Your incident response, to be quite honest, this one is more of your management controls and your team controls on what you're going to do. Now, of course, all those other things we talked about, enabling, you're logging your analytics, your virtual machines, your secure score, using policies, looking at those are all used in executing those responses. I mean, that's basically what's going to tell you there was kind of an incident, right? So this one here is more about what do you do when it happens? What are your management controls? Not a lot of, I would say, technical controls in here outside of the detection pieces of it. So you won't have a lot that you can just go flip a switch to make this, work. Again, that's about your business process and management process of how you're going to address issues. So this one here is all about our security center that we were talking about. So our security center, looking at that, setting our policies, getting through and understanding that what we've set as our baseline configuration, our network separation, like it's the more or less like the audit phase of making sure that's done. So in that, I'm going to bring us back up to Security Center. Right, so inside of Security Center, we are going to go in and I'm going to open, where is this guy? I'm staring at it. There you go. Regulatory compliance. Now, the compliance in here, we can have, you'll notice there's some ones that are applied here that are pretty typical, the ISO 27001 that I mentioned earlier, PCI, and it will start telling me which of these controls that it's detecting that I'm compliant with based on Microsoft's interpretation of the rule. And it helps give me a score kind of to show me where I'm at as far as compliance standpoints. Now, I would not say this is the end all be all with compliance, but it certainly helps in mapping the controls that are available. And you'll notice I have the Azure Security Benchmark here, which is what we're going through on what's actually being evaluated. And if we go down, you'll see there are actually rules in place by policies that are evaluating what's happening here. And most of these right here will be green. I don't have a lot of resources in here, but you'll see I'm being plagued here for this one, managing automatically, and then strong authentication controls. This one, because actually it's my demo account. I don't have MFA for this demo enabled, so it's actually tagging that. So you can see how I can come in here at a glance and see where we are based on our framework, which is also tied to a series of policies that measure our results here. The other place where we can come in and do some auditing here is Azure Defender. Now, Azure Defender inside of Security Center, it's a paid service, but it goes a little bit deeper in the analysis of the services that we have. And if I scroll down here, you'll notice we've got a few, like the VM vulnerability assessment. Now, that is just what it sounds. They use the Qualys scanner behind the scenes. So when this is enabled, if I have virtual machines here in the network, it will do those scans and then report back the findings so that I can take remediation action on them. Just-in-time VM access. Now that's less about auditing and controls there, but it's about accessing virtual machines. And this one's an interesting one because what it does is essentially you would have all of your VM access shut down by default. That's RDP access, your remote WMI, SSH, and when this is turned on, you have to request access. So it's like a privileged identity management for VM access. And I would come in, I would say I need it for like 2 hours. And what it's going to do is create a firewall rule that allows me to have access to that machine for the specified amount of time, and it sets it up so it's directly from my identified IP. So it's going to see the IP I'm logged in here. It's going to create the rule. It says, okay, I have access for remote management to the specific VM for that amount of time, and I can just then access the VM. After that, it's going to shut it down. You can use this in combination with what's called Azure Bastion host. Actually, I probably need to caveat that. I need to go back and look. That was in preview because there were some issues with that previously. But the Azure Bastion host is a service for a jump box, right? It's pretty typical to have your network, you have a jump box, remote to the jump box, then access your other resources. In this case, Microsoft provides that essentially in RDP box, so you don't manage the VMs, but you'll log on to it from inside of the Azure portal. You'll get into the Azure Bastion host, which then has access to your network resources. So if you do that with like just-in-time access in there, essentially you would open that up to the Bastion host, not your direct resource for getting access into those other machines. So it's like a double wall barrier actually for getting remote management access into those machines. Anytime application control, this is essentially whitelisting applications that runs on servers. So you can do this here at the Azure layer. If you're not doing it at the OS layer, you don't have another machine in there. Essentially, it says what's allowed to run inside of those virtual machines. Container image scanning. So when we're talking about containers, we're talking about Azure containers, Docker containers, and things like that. Adaptive network hardening. This one also is interesting. It kind of goes in with their advanced DDoS, where it's evaluating with machine learning the behaviors on your network. So it's going to learn over time what it expects to be normal. And when it's not normal, it's going to shut down access from the unnormal channels. It's going to log an alert that you can then decide what to do with. SQL vulnerability assessment, just like VM vulnerability assessments, the scanner's running at the SQL level, the SQL instance. So file integrity monitoring, this one, it's interesting, but there are some limitations on what it can do. But essentially, this gives you change level protection at your files on your OS. So think about if I had, if I'm thinking about malware or somebody's compromising my OS, I might place my operating system directory, my protected directories under watch of the file integrity monitoring. And so it's going to take a baseline scan of that and then report to me when changes happen across that, so that I know that like something's happening in that area might have been compromised. So there are some file limits if you're going to look at this that to be aware of. That means you can't just place the entire virtual machine under watch there. Network map, just a visual map that you'll get of the different resources on there. And then IoT security is more tying into if you're using edge devices, Azure IoT, and those type of things, it will start giving you information on the security of those devices, which if you're in IoT, it is pretty important. As most of you might aware that there's currently some deficiencies in that market with the devices that are currently being brought out and given, whether consumers or inside businesses. So endpoint security or EDR, this has to deal, inside of virtual machines, of course, we can run Microsoft Defender. And we talked about this a little bit yesterday. So the Microsoft Defender product is not just Windows 10. They also have executables for Linux, as well as Mac OS, which you're probably not running here in Azure, but from a Linux standpoint and a Windows Server standpoint, it does cover those if you use a Microsoft solution. We just saw in Security Center we have a few more items that we can do there beyond the Azure level reporting. If you have Security Center, you go into Azure Defender, you enable it for VM vulnerability assessments. Like it has those continuous scans as well that can let you know when you're at risk to use in conjunction with that. So this one is more around the Azure Defender product onto those servers. And it's worth pointing out that if you're not doing it today, you should be running protection on your servers. It's still something common that I see because of the applications that servers run, right? That we worry about the impact that these protection deployments have on those and the performance they might hit. I know we got to do a lot of exclusions sometimes to make them run correctly, but in the incidents where we've seen where malware is getting onto networks and it's propagating, it's using these machines that are missing this protection. It's they're either outdated on like workstations, they got the lateral movement, and then they get into a server, and all of a sudden they've got this big playing field of things that would have been stopped, but they're not because we're not running them on the server. So, equally important to run it there as well as your workstations. Backup recovery in Azure. It's a simple topic, but it can be complex in terms of where you do your backups. VMs has native backups inside of Azure. They can do snapshots. It's all API-based backups, right? So it's not like if you have it on a file share. So there is some separation there that protects you from that. You can have a level of encryption there. You can own your own keys for encrypting those backups, and you can determine where those backups go. You can have the immediate backups, say the snapshots, and maybe some warm ones locally in a subscription. And as they get older, depending on how many you got to keep, you can ship them off to maybe cold storage in another subscription. You can also, of course, run different backup products. So there are different cloud appliances. We work with a few that you might use on premises to backup equipment. They have a cloud appliances you can put in Azure that can also back up like Azure virtual machines as well. And that might come in handy if you want to unify that experience and keep everything under one umbrella. That might make sense to do that. Other services, you have to evaluate whether if you're doing app services, understanding, do I need to back up anything in Azure? If I'm just going to use my CI/CD, and if I'm using GitHub, that's my code repository and backup, that's fine. If I'm using SQL, am I using the native SQL backups or another tool? You have to kind of look at every resource that you have and then make the consideration how you're going to protect that data. Okay, so governance and security. This is our last big one. Again, it's kind of more along the lines of your internal organizational controls and what you're going to put in place. And it really starts with doing that, kind of defining it and not putting it on a shelf and putting it away, but iterating on it as new services come out, as new capabilities arise, as new needs arise, and have those rule sets in place. And I will say, when you're defining governance, the simpler you can make it, the easier it's going to be to follow and to stay compliant. But once you have that, then go in and start to map some of those security controls in place that will meet those. So you'll notice in here, right? I mean, this is essentially everything we've just talked about. It's just a summary of that, but we're stating what our organization standard is across those. And so once we've done that, we can go back and look at all of these other controls that we had, map them here, and then determine if that's appropriate for our organization. So the one thing I'll leave here, because we talked a lot about security, there's a lot that compliance comes in, and it's just understanding that when you're looking at these, they're not two separate areas, right? So security by itself is not going to mean compliance, right? You can't say, hey, I'm secure based on my standards, so therefore I'm going to meet these compliance requirements. You may not. And you can't look at a compliance framework. You can't go in and say, hey, I've checked off all the boxes for PCI, and so I'm secure. Not necessarily true. So you do have to do a little bit of risk sizing for your organization to make sure that that's true, because to say you're secure is secure enough, and you're going to accept the residual risk based on the controls that you have there, that's a personal organizational type of decision that has to be made. All right, so Jason, that's my last slide.
Thanks, Jesus. I'm gonna steal the sharing back here and kind of keep on rolling through this. Jesus, if you can confirm when you can see my slide deck again.
Yep, looks like you're up.
Awesome. Well, we're going to keep on kind of rolling through this and try to get everybody to their lunch hour a little bit early. So if you need to take a break, please feel free to step away. But thanks, Jesus, for going over security. If anybody has any questions, definitely encourage drop them in the chat. But what I'm going to talk about next is where to get started, or more accurately, how organizations can typically get started and what we can do to help you all accomplish some of the things we've talked about, but also some more tactical things. So really bringing this back down into, you know, what we've seen organizations do to take their first steps in the cloud, or even if they're in the cloud, do some simple things to extend to the cloud. No surprise to anybody, the first thing is the Azure Blueprint. I promise I won't go too far into this because we spent a good time this morning covering this, but basically if you we're following along with what we were talking about creating the blueprint, but also getting into some of these security concerns and want to really take some of these things and get it right sized and relevant for your business, whether that's an extremely complicated deployment or extremely simple. This is the best place to get started. We have funding available for managed Microsoft customers, some unmanaged customers. It is getting close to the end of Microsoft's year, so time is running out on the funding programs. Those should reasonably be open through, you know, the next several weeks for applications, all the way to potentially, you know, early to mid-June, and then next year's program should open sometime around the July-August timeframe. So there is a good time to sign up, look at funding programs, see what we're eligible for, and start planning that, because you can take advantage of funding programs at the end of one year and then be eligible to take advantage of them at the beginning of the next year to further your cloud journeys. And that could be anything from doing things like cloud architecture and design, you know, coming up with getting your cloud right the first time, doing things like hybrid cloud data protection, disaster recovery, virtual desktops. File shares is something we haven't talked a lot about, but creating hybrid file shares, how to do that in the cloud, how to do that with M365, as we were talking a lot about yesterday, is a popular topic. But also just building that public cloud adoption roadmap with Azure. The blueprint is kind of the main way to get started with any of those, and those run typically anywhere from 1 day to all the way to 5-day engagements to build out those designs and get you some plans. Also, I should say it's available to government customers as well. Not all programs are, but this one certainly is. The other one, getting a little bit more specific, is probably one of the most popular ones we see, and probably one of the easiest to accomplish, because the value of the use case, but also the complexity in data protection today, which is really how do we leverage the cloud to increase or extend our data protection capabilities. So the eGroup Cloud Backup Assessment and can also have an optional proof of concept implementation attached to it. Looks to leverage existing backup solutions that you have in your data center. You know, maybe you're using a Rubrik or a Cohesity or even a Veeam or something like that that is protecting information to disk, or protecting the disk and archiving the tape, or archiving to even cloud even. The idea here is to take a look at your data protection as a whole and understand what we can do with solutions, advanced modern data protection solutions like Rubrik, Cohesity, even Veeam in that regard, to be able to extend to Microsoft Azure to simplify your backup, increase your protection, but also you know, reduce your RTOs and your RPOs, your recovery time objectives and your recovery point objectives, so that you can be more secure and more compliant, but also eliminate complexity and costs and things like tape storage, and you know, really accelerate that time to recover. What we do with these is, first step is talking about strategy, really understanding your current state, really understanding what the business objectives are for your organization. What are your data protection requirements, your recovery point objectives, meaning, you know, if you were to lose a server or the entire data center, how quickly would you need to be back on, you know, to keep your business operational? What compliance requirements do you need for things like retention policies, those types of things? Particularly, we talked a little bit about Office 365, and someone made a great question about, you know, what if I need more than 30 days? This is a great way to have those conversations. And then recovery time objectives. We talked a little bit earlier about, you know, if you had different classes in your management groups between mission critical applications and then just kind of general support applications, you know, what are those different layered policies? Rubrik, Cohesity, and Modern Data Protection Solutions give you the ability to you know, create a policy-based strategy for your data protection, as opposed to managing the nuts and bolts of it. You can basically say this entire group of VMs, whether it's in the cloud, these applications in the cloud, these VMs or physical servers on premises, I need them to be protected. This is how long I need protection for, and this is how quickly I need to recover them. And the platforms go out and intelligently protect the information, whether it's a workload or all the way down to a file, to a SQL server, in an immutable way that's protected from ransomware, so that you can meet those objectives, whatever they are, from recovery really, really fast in terms of, I just lost an entire application and I need to bring it online in a matter of minutes, to long-term archival. I'm going to put this in the cloud, probably will never need it, but I need to retain it for compliance purposes or just in case. We'll work through that. We'll talk about enablement. That's a lot of building the things we were talking about today: security, making sure your cloud is right. We'll talk about the design of a solution, and then ultimately deliver a 5-year total cost of ownership that will show kind of what the solution would cost year one, but all the way into the future to modernize your data protection in the data center, in the cloud, between clouds, kind of all around. In that same vein, the other component of this is, backups are backups, and they're there in case we ever need them to recover everything, hopefully really, really fast, or the workloads we need really, really fast. IT resilience is all about creating highly available architectures. So we've helped organizations, whether you're cloud first and fully running in Azure today, and you're thinking, well, okay, I'm in the Azure East, or I'm in Azure West, or I'm in the UK. What happens if I lose these critical services? How do I spin them up in another Azure region to be highly available if there's an East region outage and I need to be operational in the West region or the Central region? We can talk about that. So how do we create resilient architectures, resilient by the application level, all the way up to the service level for your organization, even into probably one of the most popular ways, because it also leads to migration benefits of, I have a data center, I have a second data center. That second data center is primarily there in case I ever have to use it, but I hope I never have to use it. It typically consists of some modern technology, but aging technology that's there to keep me limping along for a period of days or weeks until I can restore my primary data center. The concept of ditching the secondary and tertiary data centers and replicating your workloads directly to the cloud, so that you have space, you're replicating data, and you don't ever have to pay for the actual VMs until you fail over, can create a significant return on investment, lower cost of disaster recovery, and even make disaster recovery available to organizations that the cost of operating a second data center, just in case they ever need it, was out of reach prior. So with our IT resilience engagement, this has probably been the one we've done the quantity most of. It's all about understanding what your organization needs to be resilient. What does resilient mean to you? Going through the strategy, talking about enablement, what are the solutions available, picking the right solution for you in terms of designing you an architecture and answering all the questions, building you a 3 to 5 year total cost of ownership, and both of on-premises, cloud costs, anywhere in between, depending on your use case. And eventually, once that's there and that all looks good, extending that into a proof of concept to start replicating VMs and demonstrate failover and things along those lines. Whether that's with eGroup and Zerto plus Microsoft Azure, or we're going to use something like Azure Site Recovery, or some of the other technologies out there, particularly if you're already in the cloud and we're using something like Azure Site Recovery between Azure regions. Another one that is popular in the sense that there's a lot of different options for this, and a lot of organizations have these types of solutions, is the overall term VDI, right? So when we're talking about things like Citrix environments or even Horizon View environments, there's capabilities around that today. And then Windows Virtual Desktop. How does Citrix and WVD work together? How does Citrix work together? How does all these different permutations of each? They're starting to blend together in the industry to create basically cloud resiliency for on-premises VDI environments, VDI environments that are fully hosted in the cloud that take advantage of things like burstable compute to really optimize costs. If I'm running a Horizon View environment, how can I have a backup VDI environment with my DR strategy that is Windows Virtual Desktop that can spin up as needed, and I can have users connect to it as well? Or how can I create View desktops in the cloud? There's a lot of different ways in which we can mix and match this, but the goal of limitless productivity is to ensure that you have secure end-user workstations, applications, desktops, where needed, to be able to provide the core applications of your business to your end users where they need them as securely as you need them with compliance. So things like financial institutions, healthcare, law firms, government organizations obviously have those compliance needs that VDI is very attractive for. But even organizations that are on the go, that have applications and want to secure the four walls of the data center, keep the end user experience in there, and kind of tightly control the end user experience and stream that to the end user, as opposed to doing more complexity at the edge. eGroup Limitless Productivity is able to scale desktops on premises, in the cloud, across clouds, dynamically. I made a success story yesterday where we were talking about a group that needed remote vendor access into the cloud. So if you wanted to let someone like eGroup come in, am I going to access your environment through my laptop? Or can we have a temporary WVD instance that has all the access and all the needs that I would need for a period of a week to run a week-long project, or a month, or a year, whatever the term would be, to secure those vendor accesses? So a lot of different things that we can do there for a lot of different VDI cases. The goal is the same as the other ones, which is, let's talk about a strategy. Let's talk about your current state. What are your business objectives? What does it mean for your end users to be successful? Let's do the enablement side, which is getting the cloud right, ensuring that your cloud is optimized to run desktop workloads. So when we talk about those policies and things we were talking about earlier, we talk about limiting things. We don't need VMs. We don't need various types of storage or databases and all these different things. So when we're running a VDI subscription, so let's create a VDI description, let's create those policies, let's design that out, and then let's scale your VDI environment to the cloud so that the workload's working there, users can access, or if they're on-prem, they can access them wherever they need to be to stay productive. Again, with this one, we'll deliver kind of the solution design, the operational benefits, ownership costs, as well as cloud and data center costs to operate this. This is a great way, specifically if you're in the Citrix world and you're looking to modernize the Citrix cloud licensing and some of those things, and move some things like storefront servers and NetScalers to the cloud, since those services from Citrix run in Azure as well. It's a great way to put the desktop controllers and stuff like that in the cloud, to be able to provision those there when you need them, only when you need them in the future. So, like I said, we wanted to get you out a little bit early today for lunch, but thank you, first of all. I know over the last 2 days, it's been a considerable investment in time. We hope to talk to you more, and we hope to talk to you more specifically about what you need, what interests you, answer your questions, and learn a lot more about your business. As I mentioned during closing remarks yesterday, one of the things I love about what I do these days, been a technical resource, been an application developer, have managed teams, have done a lot of those things. Over the last 3 or 4 years, I've had the opportunity to meet and learn about a lot of businesses, a lot about the challenges, a lot of practical solutions that take things out of the theoretical world that we were talking about earlier today, and talked about what's truly practical for a business to adopt. How can we get costs aligned to the results the organization needs to see, and truly get things done? Probably one of the most fulfilling and exciting things I do is being able to learn about you all, and figure out what makes you tick, figure out what your clients need, and figure out how to help you service them better by being productive. So we've got an array of tools, whether it's the Azure Blueprint, whether it's doing things like IT resilience, IT recovery, or limitless productivity, or it's talking about very, very tactical things about how do I address file shares because I want to reduce ransomware. All of these things have funding programs attached for leveraging Azure solutions. We can bring eGroup expertise as well as Microsoft expertise to the table to have those discussions and roadmap those out for you. So I hope you will take us up on the offer, reach out, let's have some conversations, and start learning together and figure out some things we can get done. So with that, we do have a drawing. Like yesterday, we can't see who attended the event until we actually end the meeting, so we can't do the drawing live. We will be contacting those winners and communicating out. All the recordings and the materials for this session will be on our website. If you go to egroup-us.com and you navigate to the latest, you can actually access these sessions as well as the entire library of our past sessions around Jesus's Teams Tuesdays, which are every other Tuesdays, where he hosts a team-specific event, kind of an Ask Me Anything style. Nutanix at 9, if you want to learn about hyper-converged architectures. Dan Drude leads that for us. As well as rotating semi-monthly events that we do on topics around data protection, network security, wireless, all the different things that we touch along eGroup. It's all there, as well as the upcoming events. So we hope to see you at some future events as well. And with that, we'll close. So thanks again. Any questions, please? Jesus and I will hang on for a little bit and answer those.